March 21st, 1931. Early morning. Mascot Aerodrome, Sydney. The field is quiet in the way early aviation fields often were. No terminals, no corridors of glass and steel. Just open ground, hangars set back from the runway, and the low mechanical murmur of engines warming in the cool air. The sky above Sydney is unsettled but passable, layered with broken cloud moving inland from the coast. Parked on the grass is a trimotor aircraft whose name carries quiet confidence. Southern Cloud. Its polished metal skin reflects the pale light of morning. 3 engines sit evenly spaced along the wing, each one representing redundancy, reassurance, and modern engineering. In 1931, this aircraft is not experimental. It is not fragile. It is considered dependable. This is how progress looks. Southern Cloud is scheduled to fly south to Melbourne, a route already familiar to Australia's growing network of commercial aviation. The distance is not extreme. The flight is routine. Passengers board expecting hours, not danger. The engines start in sequence. The sound is heavy and rhythmic, echoing across the field. Ground crew step back. The aircraft begins to roll. There is no ceremony, no sense of departure from the ordinary. The Southern Cloud lifts from the grass and turns southward, climbing into a sky that offers no immediate warning. As the aircraft leaves Sydney behind, weather begins to close in. Inland, the atmosphere is unstable. Cold air from the south meets warmer systems drifting across the continent. Clouds thicken. Visibility contracts. What had appeared navigable from the ground is already changing. Inside the cockpit, navigation is a matter of estimation and discipline. There is no radar, no satellite guidance, no continuous radio tracking. The crew relies on time, compass headings, airspeed, and what the sky allows them to see. When landmarks vanish beneath cloud, the margin for certainty narrows. Southern Cloud presses on. Over the great dividing range, cloud layers merge. The terrain below rises sharply, forested and uneven, its peaks hidden. The aircraft is still flying under control, engines steady. Instruments functioning. There is no emergency call. Then, silence. No arrival in Melbourne. No radio message. No sign of delay. By afternoon, concern begins to take shape. By evening, it becomes something heavier. Search aircraft are dispatched. Ground parties mobilize. They scan valleys, ridgelines, and open plains. Nothing is found. Days pass, then weeks. The sky yields no answers. Southern Cloud has vanished. For years, the aircraft exists only as a question. A modern airliner lost on a routine route without trace. Maps are studied. Theories circulate. Weather reports are re-examined. But the Australian interior is vast and aviation is still young. The wreckage will not be found for 27 years. And when it is, it will not reveal a mystery born of sabotage or failure of machinery, but of limits. Limits of navigation. By 1931, aviation in Australia was no longer an experiment. It was an assertion. The continent's distances were vast, its terrain unforgiving. Rail lines were slow. Roads were incomplete. Air travel promised compression of time, of space, of isolation. What had once taken days could now be crossed in hours. For a nation still defining its modern identity, aviation was not merely transport. It was proof of capability. Australian National Airways had been formed to meet that promise. The airline positioned itself as reliable, disciplined, and forward-looking. Its routes connected major cities along the southeastern corridor, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, creating the backbone of domestic air travel. Public confidence was essential. Every successful flight reinforced the idea that the air could be trusted. The Southern Cloud was part of that message. Built in Britain as an Avro 6-1810, The aircraft represented a mature stage of early commercial aviation design. It was a trimotor, 3 engines instead of 1, not for speed, but for real assurance. Engine redundancy was a selling forcing point in the late 1920s. If one failed, the aircraft could continue. If 2 failed, it could still remain controllable. This was the logic presented to passengers and regulators alike. Inside, the cabin was enclosed, insulated from wind and noise in a way earlier aircraft were not. Seating was orderly. The flight experience was meant to feel safe, professional, modern. But aviation progress in 1931 was uneven. Aircraft performance was advancing faster than the systems designed to support it. Meteorology remained largely observational. Weather forecasts were regional and imprecise, built from surface reports, sparse up-air data, and experience. Storm systems were understood in broad terms, but their timing, altitude, and movement were difficult to predict inland. Navigation faced similar constraints. Pilots navigated primarily by dead reckoning, calculating position using compass heading, airspeed, elapsed time, and estimated wind effect. Visual reference was essential. Rivers, towns, railways, and coastlines served as confirmation. When cloud obscured the ground, navigation became theoretical. Radio aids were limited and inconsistent. Continuous position reporting was not standard. There was no expectation that an aircraft would be tracked minute by minute. Once airborne, a flight was largely on its own. The route between Sydney and Melbourne crossed some of the most complex terrain in southeastern Australia. The Great Dividing Range rose inland, with ridges and valleys that climbed sharply from surrounding plains. In clear weather, these features were manageable. In cloud, they became invisible hazards. Despite this, the route was considered established. Aircraft flew it regularly. Experience bred confidence. On the morning Southern Cloud departed, there was no indication of exceptional danger. Weather briefing suggested deteriorating conditions inland, but nothing that would have been considered prohibitive. Aircraft and crew were cleared. The flight proceeded under accepted standards of the time. This context matters. The Southern Cloud did not depart in defiance of known danger. It departed within the norms of early commercial aviation. Norms shaped by optimism, incomplete data, and a belief that skill and prudence could bridge the gap between weather and terrain. When the aircraft failed to arrive, that belief was tested. Search operations were launched quickly, but they reflected the era's limitations. There were no emergency locator transmitters, no radar returns, no last known GPS coordinate. Search areas expanded rapidly, driven more by probability than certainty. Public attention intensified. Newspapers tracked each development. The disappearance unsettled confidence in civil aviation. If a modern, well-equipped airliner could vanish on a routine route, then the margin of safety was narrower than many had assumed. As days turned into weeks, the absence of wreckage became the story. Not what had happened, but why nothing could be found. The Southern Cloud began to occupy a space between accident and legend, a symbol of progress interrupted, suspended somewhere beyond proof. The reality, however, remained grounded in context: a capable aircraft, a professional crew, and an aviation system still learning how to see the sky clearly. Understanding the loss of Southern Cloud requires separation, not of blame, but of elements: aircraft, crew, environment, and systems. Each was functional on its own. Together, under pressure, they formed a narrowing corridor of safety. The aircraft, Southern Cloud, was an Avro 618-10, a development of the Fokker F.7 lineage. High-winged, sturdy, designed for stability rather than speed. Its 3 Armstrong Siddeley Lynx engine produced modest power, but reliability was their virtue. The aircraft cruised comfortably at low altitudes, typically between 5 and 8,000 feet. It was not designed to climb rapidly over weather systems or high terrain. Its service ceiling was limited, especially when fully loaded and operating in turbulence or icing conditions. Instrumentation reflected the era: basic engine gauges, a magnetic compass, an A-speed indicator. Altitude was inferred through pressure instruments that were less precise than later designs. There was no artificial horizon, no directional gyroscope. Spatial orientation depended heavily on visual cues. In clear air, this was efficient. In cloud, it was demanding. The aircraft had no structural defect. When the wreckage would eventually be found decades later, the A-frame showed no sign of in-flight breakup. Engines were intact. Control surfaces were consistent with controlled flight. The machine did what it was asked to do until the environment exceeded what it could safely tolerate. The crew of Southern Cloud were not inexperienced. Commercial pilots of the early 1930s were typically former military or bush pilots, accustomed to variable conditions and long distances. They operated with autonomy that would later be regulated away. Decision-making authority rested almost entirely in the cockpit. Diversions were possible, but only if weather conditions allowed navigation to alternate airfields, many of which were little more than prepared fields. Flying blind was not unusual, but it was never ideal. Without reliable radio navigation, once visual reference was lost, confidence eroded quickly. Wind drift calculation could accumulate error over time. A small misjudgment early could translate into miles of displacement later. There is no evidence the crew panicked. No distress call was made. That absence suggests they believed they remained in control. The environment. The weather system over southeastern Australia that day was unstable and laid. Reports indicate low cloud, rain, and reduced visibility over inland high ground. Conditions worsened as the day progressed. The Great Dividing Range is deceptive. From a distance, it appears as rolling elevation. Up close, it becomes a series of sharp ridges and steep valleys. In cloud, these features disappear entirely until they are dangerously close. Cloud base over the mountains can sit just above ridge height, creating the illusion of clearance while concealing terrain ahead. Pilots descending below cloud in search of visual reference could unknowingly place themselves inside the terrain envelope. Wind conditions at altitude likely differ from surface reports, introducing additional navigational drift. This was not extreme weather by modern standards, but it was complex, dynamic, and poorly observable with 1931 tools. The systems around the flight. Aviation is not just aircraft and crew. It is the network that supports them. In 1931, that network was thin, where the forecasting relied on limited observation points. Inland reports were sparse. Upper air data was almost non-existent. Forecasts described general conditions, not precise timelines or altitudes. Communication was intermittent. Radio contact was not continuous, and position reports were not mandated. If an aircraft deviated from its intended track, there was no immediate external awareness. Search and rescue planning assumed visual detection. Dense forests and mountainous terrain severely reduced the chance of spotting wreckage from the air. The system did not fail catastrophically. It functioned as designed, but its design assumed that aircraft would remain visible, audible, and reachable. Southern Cloud would do none of those things. The intersection of these angles reveals the core truth of the accident. This was not a story of incompetence or neglect. It was a story of margin. Margin between terrain and cloud. Between estimated position and actual location. Between what the crew believed they could see and what was truly there. As that margin narrowed, the flight continued, controlled and purposeful, into a space where recovery would no longer be possible. At some point after leaving the coastal plain, the Southern Cloud entered weather that erased certainty. Cloud layers thickened as the aircraft moved inland. Visibility diminished. The ground below, once a reliable reference, began to fragment and then disappear entirely. From the cockpit, the world narrowed to instruments that could only describe motion, not position. The aircraft remained under control. Engines ran evenly. Airspeed was maintained. There is no indication of abrupt maneuvering or mechanical distress. This was not an emergency in the conventional sense. It was a gradual tightening of conditions, a progressive reduction of options. Dead reckoning depends on assumptions. Wind strength, wind direction, time over a given heading. In unstable weather, these assumptions degrade quickly. A modest unaccounted crosswind can shift an aircraft miles off course over the span of an hour. Over flat terrain, that error is survivable. Over mountainous forest, it is not. The Great Dividing Range does not announce itself. Peaks rise unevenly, often hidden until the final moments. In low cloud, ridge lines offer no contrast. What appears as open space may be rising ground. Evidence suggests the southern cloud descended, likely in an attempt to regain visual reference beneath the cloud base. This was a common and often necessary practice in the era. Without artificial horizon instruments, prolonged flight in cloud increased the risk of spatial disorientation. Descending toward clearer air was a rational decision, but the cloud base was deceptive. In mountainous terrain, cloud can cling to ridges while leaving valleys partially visible. A pilot descending through broken cloud may briefly glimpse forested slopes, creating the impression of clearance ahead. That impression can vanish seconds later. The aircraft continued forward, still under control, still flying normally. There was no sudden dive, no violent evasive turn. The wreckage location, when eventually discovered, showed no evidence of an attempt to climb away at the last moment. This suggests the crew did not see the terrain in time to react, or saw it too late for available performance to matter. At cruising speed, a trimotor aircraft of this class covers distance relentlessly. Even a few seconds of delayed recognition can eliminate any margin for escape. The impact occurred on a remote mountainside, deep within dense forest. Trees absorbed the initial contact. The aircraft was destroyed by force, not fire. There was no post-impact blaze visible from the air, one of the reasons it would remain hidden for decades. In 1931, this sequence left no trace that could be followed. No radar return ended abruptly. No emergency transmission marked the final position. No smoke plume guided search aircraft. The southern clouds simply ceased to exist in the observable system of aviation. What remained was absence. For investigators at the time, the accident could not be reconstructed. Without wreckage, without data, conclusions were necessarily cautious. Weather was suspected, navigation error considered, terrain acknowledged, but nothing could be proven. Only decades later, when bushwalkers stumbled upon scattered metal fragments high in the ranges, would the final geometry become clear. The aircraft had not fallen from the sky. It had flown, intact, controlled, and unaware, into the ground. This was controlled flight into terrain long before the term existed, shaped not by recklessness, but by the quiet convergence of cloud, geography, and technological limits. When the southern cloud failed to arrive in Melbourne, the response was immediate by the standards of the time and insufficient by the demands of the task. Search aircraft were dispatched along the expected route. Pilots flew low over open country, scanning for wreckage, smoke, or disturbed vegetation. Ground parties moved along rail lines, roads, and accessible valleys. Reports from farmers and remote communities were gathered and followed up. The problem was scale. Southeastern Australia is vast. The Great Dividing Range alone stretches for hundreds of kilometers, much of it densely forested and sparsely populated. From the air, trees form an unbroken surface. An aircraft that does not burn can vanish completely. Search planners had no confirmed last position. Navigation uncertainty meant the southern cloud could have been significantly north or south of its intended track. Each additional mile of possible deviation expanded the search area exponentially. Weather further hampered efforts. Cloud and rain persisted in the days following the disappearance. Flying conditions limited visibility for search crews, replicating the very conditions that had likely caused the accident. As days passed without results, hope began to thin. Newspapers followed every development. Public confidence in aviation wavered. Commercial air travel was still earning its legitimacy, and the disappearance of a modern airliner without explanation struck at the heart of that trust. Investigators face an uncomfortable truth. Without wreckage, there could be no definitive cause. Official statements avoided speculation. Mechanical failure could not be confirmed. Sabotage was dismissed for lack of evidence. Weather and navigation remained the most probable factors, but probability was not proof. The southern cloud entered a long period of uncertainty. The families of those aboard were left without remains, without a site, without resolution. Memorials were abstract. Grief had no location. Years passed. Aviation advanced. New navigation aids were introduced. Radio communication improved. Aircraft climbed higher, flew faster, and crossed weather systems rather than yielding to them. The southern cloud faded from headlines into history. Then, in October 1958, 27 years after the disappearance, a group of bushwalkers in the snowy mountains region noticed something unnatural in the forest. Twisted metal, weathered fabric, shapes that did not belong. Authorities were notified. Investigators reached the site. The remains were identified conclusively as a southern cloud. The location explained everything, and nothing. The wreckage lay on a steep mountainside, consistent with controlled flight into rising terrain. There was no evidence of fire, no sign of mechanical failure prior to impact. The aircraft had struck the slope and disintegrated, its components scattered by gravity and time. What the site confirmed was crucial. The southern cloud had not broken apart in the air. It had not vanished mysteriously. It had followed a plausible, tragic path consistent with the limits of its era. What it could not provide was detail. No flight data existed. No cockpit voice recordings. Time and environment had erased fine evidence. The investigation could close only at a high level. But closure, even partial, mattered. For aviation authorities, the discovery reinforced lessons already emerging worldwide. Terrain awareness could not rely solely on visual reference. Weather forecasting needed altitude awareness. Search and rescue doctrine had to account for non-burning crashes in forested regions. The southern cloud became a quiet reference point, a reminder not of mystery, but of vulnerability. When the southern cloud failed to arrive in Melbourne, the response was immediate by the standards of the time and insufficient by the demands of the task. Search aircraft were dispatched along the expected route. Pilots flew low over open country, scanning for wreckage, smoke, or disturbed vegetation. Ground parties moved along rail lines, roads, and accessible valleys. Reports from farmers and remote communities were gathered and followed up. The problem was scale. Southeastern Australia is vast. The Great Dividing Range alone stretches for hundreds of kilometers, much of it densely forested and sparsely populated. From the air, trees form an unbroken surface. An aircraft that does not burn can vanish completely. Search planners had no confirmed last position. Navigation uncertainty meant the southern cloud could have been significantly north or south of its intended track. Each additional mile of possible deviation expanded the search area exponentially. Weather further hampered efforts. Cloud and rain persisted in the days following the disappearance. Flying conditions limited visibility for search crews, replicating the very conditions that had likely caused the accident. As days passed without results, hope began to thin. Newspapers followed every development. Public confidence in aviation wavered. Commercial air travel was still earning its legitimacy, and the disappearance of a modern airliner without explanation struck at the heart of that trust. Investigators face an uncomfortable truth. Without wreckage, there could be no definitive cause. Official statements avoided speculation. Mechanical failure could not be confirmed. Sabotage was dismissed for lack of evidence. Weather and navigation remained the most probable factors, but probability was not proof. The Southern Cloud entered a long period of uncertainty. The families of those aboard were left without remains, without a site, without resolution. Memorials were abstract. Grief had no location. Years passed. Aviation advanced. New navigation aids were introduced. Radio communication improved. Aircraft climbed higher, flew faster, and crossed weather systems rather than yielding to them. The Southern Cloud faded from headlines into history. Then, in October 1958, 27 years after the disappearance, a group of bushwalkers in the snowy mountains region noticed something unnatural in the forest. Twisted metal, weathered fabric, shapes that did not belong. Authorities were notified. Investigators reached the site. The remains were identified conclusively as a Southern Cloud. The location explained everything, and nothing. The wreckage lay on a steep mountainside, consistent with controlled flight into rising terrain. There was no evidence of fire, no sign of mechanical failure prior to impact. The aircraft had struck the slope and disintegrated, its components scattered by gravity and time. What the site confirmed was crucial. The Southern Cloud had not broken apart in the air. It had not vanished mysteriously. It had followed a plausible, tragic path consistent with the limits of its era. What it could not provide was detail. No flight data existed. No cockpit voice recordings. Time and environment had erased fine evidence. The investigation could close only at a high level. But closure, even partial, mattered. For aviation authorities, the discovery reinforced lessons already emerging worldwide. Terrain awareness could not rely solely on visual reference. Weather forecasting needed altitude awareness. Search and rescue doctrine had to account for non-burning crashes in forested regions. The Southern Cloud became a quiet reference point, a reminder not of mystery, but of vulnerability.